And don't let him come pick your peaches. He'll fall out. Yes, ma'am.
We have some oaks in our yard that broke from the ice last year, and at the point where they broke, we have that little weedy, multiple growths. Is there something to do to help that?
If it's on a limb, I would go ahead and cut the limb further back to where you have a limb coming out. If there's not a limb there, then you pick the one strongest one and cut all the rest of them away. And if they're happening, if there's this big mass of scarred up tissue, cut it back, because you've got a lot of fracturing that takes place in that wood. And that one strong limb is going to start to grow, but it's on such a weak base. The next ice storm or windstorm, it's going to break and be done with. So cut it further back. In some cases, cut the limb all the way off the tree, but get it back to where you're on good, strong, healthy tissue. And on the question of pruning paint or other paint, you use pruning paint on red oaks and on live oaks. You don't use it on anything else. Waste of time, and it's hard on the tree. Pruning paint actually slows down the healing of tissue. So we don't want to use it on elms, we don't want to use it on pecans, we don't want to use it on red buds, we don't want to use it on fruit trees. The only reason we use pruning paint is we have to keep out the little insects that may bring in the oak wilt disease. If anybody's interested, we'll do a whole seminar on oak wilt sometime. That's the other thing. You know, we do this because you're interested in doing it. We have a lot of different topics we'll cover. We do this all the way up until June. If you got a specific topic you want to talk about, if there's interest, we'll be happy to schedule a seminar on it. Yes, sir.
Burke and Monterey, you don't have to paint, huh?
That is, some people say yes, because every oak tree out there can get oak wilt. But oak wilt is not a devastating disease to Monterey oaks or Lacey's oaks or Burr oaks or chinkapin oaks. Only the live oaks and the red oaks are trees that are really going to be killed by it. So those are usually the only ones I bother to paint.
Your trees that normally get a lot bigger than peaches, like pears and apples, can you prune them the same way?
You can, just not quite to the same extent. Pears are sort of a special case in that pears really want to grow upright. And it's a funny thing, the limbs that are growing straight up will have very few fruit on them. The limbs that kind of arch out will have lots of fruit on them. So even though you can't really make an open-centered tree out of a pear tree, you would like those limbs to be more outward. And I've seen a lot of different techniques. Some people take a little piece of wood and cut a notch in each end and jam it in there and physically force the limb to grow more outward. The more creative thing looks funny and people really will wonder about you, but I've seen people take the big downrigger balls like you use for deep fishing and tie them on the limbs to pull them out. And those, seriously, it looks weird, but then you have 10 times more fruit on that limb than you do on the upright ones, and people are realizing it's a good thing to do. So you're not going to be able to turn a pear into an open-centered tree, but try to keep your branching lower and try to make your branches more outward.
Do you top it at all?
Probably so. I usually do if it's a young tree. If it's a big tree, I probably wouldn't go back in after the fact. But a young tree, yes, I will top it and try to get the branches, the main branches coming out within the first 5 feet of trunk. Yes, ma'am. Oh, sure. Yeah, if you want to espalier something, you can certainly do that. Yeah, absolutely. Yes, ma'am.
I have like several xylosomals and they're shrubby on the top and shrubby
I'm going to come to shrubs in just a second. We'll tell you all about them. Yes, ma'am. Anybody else? 1, 2, 3, go. Yes.
I have a Satsuma orange tree that I planted in the ground. A sunny spot, but it's sheltered on 2 sides. It's come through the winters fine, but it is so big I didn't prune it. They have limbs that bore fruit 2 feet from the ground. It goes up about 10 feet tall at least, and growing. So do I top it? I mean, cut it back?
If it's that big, I wouldn't really top it, but I would go through, and we'll talk about selective pruning. I would selectively take out some of the higher limbs. I would probably take off a couple of the lower limbs that are in the way. But that's just to reduce the size, and we'll spend a whole 5 minutes on overgrown plants in just a minute. Yes, ma'am.
Lemon tree, how about that? Can you prune them? I mean...
Lemon trees, watch them real carefully because most lemons are grafted. And you want to be sure you keep any grafts off the rootstock. Pruning a lemon is basically to shape it. And if you remember the things I'm telling you about what makes different buds grow, you trim it to any shape that you like.
Okay, and it seems like it's had fruit twice a year. Mine has anyway. It's in a big pot. So is it a time? Can I prune it now?
The best time, and I'll go ahead and answer that because it's going to apply to plants that produce berries, which I want to talk about in a minute. But anything that makes berries or fruit, be it holly, be it pyracantha, be it citrus trees, the time that I like to prune those is while they are in bloom. Why is that? It's because that way, if I have a choice of 2 limbs, I'm going to have to take one of those 2 limbs out. This one has 10 blossoms on it, this one has 2 blossoms on it. I'm going to take off the one with 2 blossoms because I'd rather have 10 lemons than 2. In the case of pyracantha, I'd rather have a limb that's covered with berries than one that has sporadic flowers up and down it. So citrus, I like to prune while it is in bloom. Now, tropical plants, plants that grow year-round, and this is sort of what we in radio call a segue, we're moving into a new subject. Plants that grow year-round, you can prune them any time of the year. There's not a good time or a bad time, but you do things in the case of citrus. You try to prune while they're in bloom if that's possible. Overgrown things like greenhouses are funny things. They shrink. You know, you wonder how a wooden plaster or a wooden glass structure can shrink. But I can promise you, if you take your plants out of the greenhouse in the spring, and then you go to put the same number of plants back in the greenhouse in the fall, they don't fit. And I think it's because the greenhouse shrunk. I don't think it's the plant. Anyway, the temptation on tropical plants is always to cut them back in the fall, just so you can get them back inside. And if it's a question of cut them back or let them freeze, then cutting them back is a good thing. But typically on plants that are growing all the time, the fall is the worst time of all to prune. I'm going to give you one more quick science lesson. The thing that makes a limb stretch, or a stem stretch as it grows, again, there's a little growth hormone in there, oversimplified, but it makes this individual cells stretch. That hormone is broken down by sunlight. So the brighter the sun, the more compact the growth. Does that make sense? The reason that plants bend toward the light, I'm sorry all you Eastern meditators and all that sort of stuff, they're not seeking the light or the warmth of the sun. You got this stem right here, and you got the sun hitting it on one side. So what's happened? It's broken down this cell stretching hormone on this side, but not on this side. The back of the stem is growing faster than the front of the stem, so what happens? The plant is bending toward the sunlight. That's why plants grow toward the sun. That's why it's important to spin them around every now and then if they're only getting light from one side, in the case of your house plants. But in the fall of the year, the days are shorter, the light is less intense, you've got less sunlight to break that down, so what happens? You get lanky, spindly growth. That's why the growth that comes out in the winter is so much less attractive than the growth that comes out in the spring and summer when the sun is much brighter. So pruning tropical plants back in the fall is a bad idea if you can avoid it, because you'll end up with a lot of weak, spindly growth over the winter months, which you have to prune back again in the spring. Now if it's prune it back or let it freeze, prune it back and drag it inside and deal with the consequences later. But the time to prune your overgrown ixoras and bougainvilleas and hibiscus and all the things that you dragged inside for the winter, the best time to prune them is when you first take them out in the spring and that new growth comes, because you got good strong sunlight, and that's when you want to get that compact, sturdy growth. So if you have to prune them, do it in the fall, but the much better time is to prune them in the spring. Deciduous trees, trees that lose their leaves, I like to prune them in the winter months because I can see the limb structure a whole lot better, and I'm not guessing, you know, at which limb has, you know, one given amount of growth. It's amazing how often somebody's looking and say, I want to take this limb off, so they go back here and cut. And that limb stays in place, but this big beautiful limb that was over here goes toppling out of the tree. It's a lot easier to see what's happening when the leaves aren't on it. But there never really is a bad time to prune trees. Shrubs, there are better times. The one time that you really do not want to prune, again on shrubs, is in the fall. And why is that? Because when you first prune a plant, it's going to put on this whole flush of new